Thanks as always for listening to Fluff and Crunch. Make sure to subscribe, like, ring the bell, all that good stuff, regardless of what platform you're using. Today, Chris and I are going to talk about story ideas, where you as a GM could get started with Vampire the Masquerade 2nd Edition. We hit it last time, talked about the world and the setting and why you should try this version of the game, and now we give you some story ideas. If you want to jump right to the content, go ahead and fast forward to the 4-minute mark, and that's where we get going. Am I supposed to ask you about your gaming in the last week?
Yeah, 'cause I had a big game weekend.
Oh,
Okay,
did you really? Okay.
I only played one game, but still. Yeah, so because we've been playing, we've got to the point near the end of the summer where we've been playing ISS for so long, and it didn't look like we were getting that close to the end. So we kind of said, right, let's book a weekend away. Let's go away at the end of sometime in September. Let's have a weekend away and grind out a bunch more
Oh,
sessions.
yeah. I saw your pictures too.
So that ended up being the weekend just gone, which was convenient because we got to the point we'd done like we'd done this mission which we thought was going to be this big mission where we meet these aliens. It ended up not being a big mission. It was like um and then we got to the point where we knew there was only a couple of missions left after, so it worked out really well time wise. We ended up playing, so we went to stay at an Airbnb, and we played one game Friday night when we got there, and then we played a game Saturday morning, went for lunch, played another game Saturday afternoon, went out for an evening meal, and then came back and played another game. And then it went a bit Return of the Kings because we were like, we've done the final mission. And then it's like, you go here, haha, but there's this twist. And we're like, oh, no. And then now you have to do this other thing, and it's changing all the rules, but it's really exciting. It uses all your characters. We're like, oh, it's like 1:30 in the morning. I just want to go to bed. But we finished.
Good.
So we have finished it. So it got to the point, and I found this with a lot of big campaign board games, like all the Pandemic Legacy games, which I've played, have all gone the same way, that as you get nearer the end, it's starting to feel a bit more like a chore. Like we're so close to it. We don't want to quit because we're so close to the end.
Yeah.
But really, we kind of got a bit bored of this now, and we really just want to jack it in. But we're so close, and we just got to finish it. And then once we finish it, it's more like a yes, we've finished it, and we don't have to play it anymore, rather than a like, yeah, that was awesome.
All right.
Which is not really what it should be.
But I mean,
yes.
overall, though, you enjoyed it.
I think as across the whole thing, I mean, like towards the end, there was a couple of missions we didn't enjoy, and we felt the rules maybe went. I mean, I think we should do a review on this sometime.
Okay. We can talk
thing,
about that in detail then later.
At nearer the end, it kind of soured us a bit on it. But then if I think we go across the whole, I mean, I think in total we played like, 20 games of this. Like after we were saying like, this is the longest we've played anything since possibly when we were in like high school and played a 2nd edition D&D campaign.
That's an accomplishment for adults.
Yeah. So it was, it was a big old long thing, and it's been a good chunk of this year, but we are now done and we can play different things.
Good.
So, but it was a good weekend. And,
good. I'm glad to hear that.
How about you?
Well, I had two players out for various and sundry life things, and so we did not play Traveler. We ended up playing or testing my horror game again, and it went all right. Every time, it's play testing. Every single time you run the thing, you find things that you're like, that doesn't work, or that does work, or I need to polish that up. So yeah, progress made, and lots of work ahead. So it was good. It was good. Yeah.
Well, no segue for that one.
No segue at all today. Okay, no segue at all. We're just gonna jump right in and feet first, head first, whatever you want to say. And last time we talked about why you ought to give Vampire the Masquerade second edition, a shake.
I think what we want to talk about is how to actually, not how to play it, how as a GM you might have to consider some of the differences in setting up a game, and what the players are going to do. Yeah. One of our big criticisms, all right, maybe mostly it's mine. So one of my criticisms of lots of role-playing games is when it's not an obvious system, like a setting, and the setting doesn't tell you what to do. Yeah. Now, Vampire would be right up there for this. Like, I remember reading the Vampire rule book and thinking, like, this is so cool, and it's so cool, and the art's cool, and the characters are cool, everything's so cool. But then if I'd had to run it, I would have been like, oh,
what do I do?
And I wouldn't have had a clue. So luckily, when I first came across Vampire, I wasn't running, I was playing in it, and same with Mage. So I never had to run any of these games when they were first out in the 90s. And when I have eventually run Vampire, I don't know, last year.
Yeah.
I did have a tool which either I can go into now or we will talk about. I will get to eventually.
Yeah, I think one of the key issues, if you're a GM who has not run this before and you listened to the previous episode and you thought, huh, that's interesting. Or you're a player and you'd like to play this. Yeah, there's that question of, okay, it is this great setting and it seems to have these great stories, and it does, but the question is, yeah, what do I do? How do I come up with things to do in this? What kinds of stories? So that's what we wanted to talk about today, some ideas, especially if you are approaching this completely from the outside. Like, where do you start? If the mopey goth urban fantasy players are the monsters, trying to not be monsters, but leveraging the fact that they're monsters and things like that. If that it sounds interesting, where do you go and what do you do with it? Um, I want to start off with a suggestion, actually, and I'll put a link in the notes to this. A suggestion that if you are coming from the outside as a GM, obviously you need the second edition rulebook or the 20th anniversary rulebook, and you need to read it. If you read the descriptions of each of the clans and you read, spread throughout the book, there's all kinds of setting information and ideas about stories. If you read that, what I recommend you start off with or consider starting off with is there's an adventure called Alien Hunger. And Alien Hunger is it's based on the idea, and it's really actually, I think, built for a group of players who have never played the game and therefore don't know the world. Because one of the things about Vampire that's really important is that if you're going to play it well and leverage all the different story possibilities for it, you have to play as if your character fits in that world, which requires that you as a player have a decent amount of knowledge about that world. Well, if you're coming in as a new player, you're not going to. So aside from the dreaded info dump from your GM, or your GM gives you homework before the first session, how do you learn about this very unique and distinct setting so that you can operate your character well within it and enjoy the things that it can do? Alien Hunger posits the idea that the player characters are essentially jumped in to being vampires by this, and I don't want to give away too much if you end up playing it, but there's this vampire who is he is something of a renegade, and so he comes up with a way to create other vampires of different types because he wants to do. There are some things that have to do with experiments and science and weird politics. All he has, is like your typical, not necessarily bad guy, but antagonist who causes problems for the protagonists. The player characters are forcibly turned into vampires, and they have no clue what the heck is going on, and so they are dumped into this world where there are hostile entities all around them, and they actually wake up in the basement of a burning building. So, I mean, it's in medias res. You have to jump right in and start trying to figure things out. But the nice thing is that the way that the module is explained and the way the NPCs operate, there are plenty of ways for the player characters to learn what the heck am I? What is going on? And then in succession, they learn more about what's going on in the world. It's a really good. I've run it several times in the last 3 decades. And every time it turns out well because it gives you an opportunity to play the game, but also learn what the world is about while you're doing it. So that's a super easy, low-hanging fruit place to start, is Alien Hunger. And like I said, I'll put a link in it. The nice thing, last comment on it, the nice thing about Alien Hunger, just as a starting place, is that you as GM, you can ratchet up the darkness and grimness or turn it down a little bit. And I actually, the first time that I ran it was like over 30 years ago. And the players at the end, I asked them what they thought of it, and they said, we enjoyed it, but it was really kind of dark. Like, we really felt like our characters couldn't win. And I was like, well, that's one of the potential tropes of vampire. Like, this is not, this isn't puppies, rainbows, and everybody happy with a friggin' dwarven scone. Not to mention any other games out there. But so, like I said, off the shelf, Alien Hunger, great place to start.
I talk about how I started last time.
Yeah.
And then you can attach this photo to. I'm not going to pop it up now, but there's
No,
a separate
there's a
photo.
link a graphic that he's referring to.
So I mean, this won't the place I've seen this is in Vampire Fifth Edition, which if you could pick up the PDF cheap, then you use this and you can still play second edition because I think on the whole second edition is probably the better game. I played fifth purely because actually it removes some stuff, so I was looking for a slightly easier game. Because the what's the big one?
Yeah,
Oh, the
we
20th
don't need to get into the
the
differences
20th
between them.
anniversary I had to load myself and I didn't want to. So this has the idea of what's called a relationship map, which will be you can find it. I've seen this in other games, I've seen this in Smallville, I've seen this in other places. It wasn't an original idea, but it made this really helpful for me trying to come up with how I was going to do it. So you start off with literally right, you have the characters. What's the connection between the character? And you draw this on a bit of paper, but then you start writing down other things. So like, right, who was your human people? So then you write down some people. What did they do before they became a vampire? What were their jobs? Were there places they went? Where did they live? Were there non-vampire family members or employers or any friends who would be relevant? And then you'd go into things like, right, well, what happened when you became a vampire? So then you have a really key, which I think to me is a really key thing of vampires. Who is your sire? Who turned you into a vampire? Because they have to be, as far as I understand it, they have to be from the same clan as you.
Yeah, because if your sire produces you and then infuses you with their blood, which passes on their vampiric heritage, which means you're of the same clan. And so then
So
there's a whole
straight away,
political side to it as to
yeah. So
why
then
was that
that
person allowed to create you and such
yeah.
and so forth.
So then that gives you a straight away a couple of other connections because you've got the person that created you. And did they do it on purpose, or were they forced into it, or were you a side thought and they didn't really care? Are they now looking after you? That gives you a bunch, and that also gives you then someone you can go to for help potentially. And then you have a kind of bunch of questions like, right, well, what do you do now? What's your cover? Where do you hang out? Are you involved in the masquerade? And by drawing that diagram, that gave me a bunch of stuff. Like I had a very clear thing of like who were the other characters they knew, who was some of the key people, and we were playing in Las Vegas because we thought that'd be funny having like Sin City and vampires. We liked that idea.
It's a good one.
And who were the key players in the city, both human and non-vamp. What do they do? And that gave me a bunch of ideas that then like I went and then flicked through some other adventures and kind of got an idea. I mean, I think in the end what I ended up doing is there'd been a Vampire the Masquerade graphic novel, and I think I wholesale just ripped a bunch of the ideas from that story into this work venture and put it into like this relationship diagram that I had. And it works really well because we basically had a whole bunch of characters they were going to know. And one thing we started very, very like early on after they'd been embraced. So like you said, one of the big problems playing Vampire is that certainly if you play a character that's meant to have been around for 100 years, then your player should know everything. So it was very much like, right, we're going to go for brand new vampires that have only been embraced maybe in a month, and you know what you can do because you've looked at your abilities, but you don't know everything because you're a new vampire. You know about your clan and a few bits, and that's about it. And that's a nice easy way to start with to have newish vampires that have only been embraced recently. Once
Right.
people
They're
have
not
been,
going to have a broad base of knowledge. A
yeah,
player could know far more than the character would.
yeah, I mean, this thing to some extent, it's almost worth having how long a player's been
Hmm.
how long a character's been a vampire related to how much the player knows about the setting. If you've got a player that's never touched vampire before, it's worth having. Then you could know a bit more, but the other way is really difficult. So if you've got a player who's been playing this for 30 years and they're an expert and they know everything, having them be, unless they're a really good role player, having them be newly embraced could be an issue because they know everything already.
Right.
It might be better to go, actually, they've been around for 100 years because they know everything. You don't have to do that. I mean, that's always the case. You've always got that problem in any role playing game of the difference between, a player's
Player
intelligence and
knowledge
the
and character
character's
knowledge. Yeah, for
intelligence.
sure.
But yeah, I found the idea of a relationship diagram a really good starting point because then rather than having to worry about like, what are my players going to do? It was like, well, I've already got things here. I've got my settings out. I've got my city, more of a sandbox kind of thing. I've got, and some people might play lots of other role playing games like this, but I've got this very clear thing of here's the other characters, here's the other important locations, and I can work with this. So rather than like, what adventure Vampire's not that kind of game. This is more like, this person on their relationship
Yeah.
diagram has a thing that needs sorting, and when they go and sort that, other stuff's gonna happen, and there's these
Yeah.
other people that might get involved. So having all these characters set up is was very, very useful for me as a starting point anyway.
Yeah, I think one of the key things to recognize about this game, if you're coming from the outside, is that sounds kind of corny, but it's absolutely true, is that the relationships between the characters, player characters and NPCs, and and NPCs and otherwise, the relationship is between those characters is really what drives the story. Remember
Yeah.
that the vast majority, if you want to leverage Vampire for the things that it can do well, okay, the things that make it special, you want intrigue. You need to lean into the intrigue and the politics. And that means relationships, connections, favors owed, old grudges, all those kinds of things between the characters. Now, the nice thing is that, I've created these before. I mean, eons ago when I used to run this game regularly, you create these, you create the NPCs, and you say, okay, who's the prince of the city? That is, who's the one vampire who's in charge of the city? Okay, who are his or her top advisors or allies or enemies or frenemies or whatever?
Mhm.
And what's really interesting is that if as you start doing that, you sit down and you're like, okay, let's see, the Prince of Phoenix, Arizona. How's that? The Prince of Phoenix, Arizona is such and such. Okay, whatever. Here's a name, here's the clan. Okay, well, in the rule book, each of the clans, you're given some boilerplate information about the general, obviously, this isn't in every instance, but the general view of members of that clan, of members of specific other clans, and their views of those other clans. And so, for example, like the Bruja, who are the rebels, they tend to chafe under the Ventru, who are very into like order and expecting that they're the aristocracy and they're going to be in charge. And so if you decide, for example, okay, I'm going to have the prince of the city be a Ventru, which is low-hanging fruit. They tend to be the ones that gravitate toward being in charge and asserting that and trying to work toward that. You go, okay, so the Prince of Phoenix is going to be a Ventru. Her name is, such and such a whatever. Okay, let's see. Her top ally is such and such. And then you decide, you start to sketch these people out and you write the connections between them. Now, one of the nice things too is that there are tons of examples of this. All of the by night books, and I've got links in the notes to Chicago by Night, which is a classic, DC by Night, and Los Angeles by Night. Those all offer three different stock cities with specific vampires and power structures and problems and local issues and things like that. All of those have lots of examples of these relationship maps. The great thing is that however experienced or aged or whatever, how connected your characters are in a given city, once you have an idea based on these relationship maps of how this one relates to that one, depending on how your characters interact with one, can flow over to the other. One of the things that I found in using this approach with these relationship maps is not so much like, oh, I've seen this in other adventures, like ideas for writing adventures that are based not around like linear events, but like nodes of information, like investigations. You don't do that in Vampire. You're if there's a plot, really, it's based in those relationships and the connections between the different characters and like what the NPCs are up to in the background that are trying to manipulate events to their benefit, or they want to use the player characters, things like that. So I think that's a great place to start. And there, like I said, there are a number of good examples of those, how those connections underpin the state of affairs in a given place. So that's another good place to start for sure.
So we kind of said how we can set it up, but we still have to kind of cover that. So what might a vampire adventure look like? Because we kind of said we've given the tone, we've given where we can start, and how we can make it easier on the GM to kind of dump a bit of knowledge or give the GM some things to go with. But we still actually need to help these GMs out with what kind of things might a
Yeah.
vampire party be asked to do
So
or might
here's
do.
where I've typically started. I usually I either start in a city because it's always a city. Remember, vampires are urban creatures. So you can do from my perspective, you can do one of two things. You either pick a big city that is not near you, that is something totally unknown, has some high points to it, like, Chicago. Chicago's got, there are things about Chicago you can look up, you can find pictures of, you can find maps of, and of course, there's this book called Chicago by Night that helps a bunch. There are other ones as well. My thought is you pick an iconic city, okay, that you either get a book or you create your quote unquote world of darkness. That is, what's the creepy supernatural stuff that's going on just out of sight of the world that we perceive. You do that, or if you live in an area that is big enough to support in the game some kind of vampire population, you start it where you are.
Yeah.
And you rely on all the knowns of places, and you vampirify and World of Darknessify all the, like, the clubs. You put, creepy things going, like, for example, in my town where I used to run a lot of these stories, there's like an indie movie theater that shows, for years they've shown Rocky Horror Picture Show, and they show all like the weirdo indie movies and stuff. And so one of the characters was a Nosferatu who decided that he had like used his powers and influence and whatnot to his lair, his haven, rather, using the terminology. His haven, we decided, was like in some, like, up some room in this weirdo theater. So he lived in the theater somewhere. He had this place, and like he had like insinuated himself into the business, and so that's why, like, that's how he was able to support himself, and have a place where he could safely hide. So you take the backdrop that's around you, and you turn it into, you add this layer of like supernatural creepiness, the stuff behind the scenes, which actually is kind of fun, because as you're driving around town or thinking about things, you're like, man, what if there was some weird crap going on in that building, or in this part of town, or with this kind of politics, or this with our sleazy mayor, or something like that. And I've had great success with that as well. The stock cities that you can just buy the books for are super easy. You buy the book, you commit the time, frankly, as a GM, to reading it, because it'll give you all the plots and it'll give you all the relationships and things like that. Or, like I said, you go very local if you live in a place that you could justify as supporting, 5, 6, 7 vampires. That's only a starting point, though. What are you thinking?
I was thinking you didn't answer the question. That's what I was thinking.
You're right. Well, I was raised in a middle class family. Just kidding. Anyway, I hope you don't get that. I just don't want. Anyway, so here's my answer, actually. I think the easiest way, and it's totally hackneyed, it's totally stereotypical, it's tropish to the nth degree, but it works. The player characters are young vampires, and in game terminology, that's a neonate. You're like newly embraced. You're new to the world of vampires, and because of that, you are the low one on the totem pole, which means that you are everyone else's. You can run errands. You are forced to run errands, and so the prince of the city or some other powerful vampire in the city has some issue that he or she wants resolved, looked into, protected, whatevered.
Yeah.
Says, listen, you're going to do this for me. And then what you do is, like a good GM, you plot that out, and then you include a twist. And the twist could either be that this patron has an ulterior motive, or in some way or another is trying to screw you over or use you up. You're just a means to an end, or you discover something else along the way. There has to be some kind of a twist that's intrigue like, that makes it, or intrigue related, that makes this, say the prince of the city says, listen, I want you to make sure that there's this building and I have some interest in it, and I want you to look after it for the next like month or so. Okay. Well, maybe in looking over it, so there are some other vampires from out of town, or maybe a werewolf or something that's trying to get into the building. So then there's a little bit of combat, there's some sneaking around and stuff like that. But then in the process of this, you discover that the reason why, and you don't ask questions, but you discover that the reason why the prince wants to protect this building is because maybe the prince has like embraced, that has created a couple of vampires that his or her superior in a nearby larger city would not want, or maybe there's some like renegade vampire that for some reason the prince is sheltering for some period of time. And now you're like, whoa, wow. So do we do we use this against the prince? Do we somehow let the prince know that like we know, but we're on his side? Do we contact like, the prince from the other city that would want to stomp our prince if he found out that this was going on? Do we gain faith? Like, you throw in that twist that that'll present the players with a substantive decision that has, upsides and downsides to it. So the errand for the prince or the errand for the elder vampires, that's the easiest way to like get them rolling.
Yeah, I think definitely going, because I think staying away from the prince is probably a good idea to start with, but you've got this whole the head of each of the clans in that
Yes.
city, because you're going to have the prince top, but then underneath that you're going to have like essentially you have a court, and this could be the main, the head of each of the clans in the town of city. You're going to have other people that are high up in the court, and all of these people are going to have things they need doing, and brand new groups of vampires who are willing to do it are great.
Yeah.
And again, it's the what, but I mean, the what, just go to any of the places which show you what in any game. It's, you only have a limited thing. You're protecting something, you are killing someone, you are stealing something. And your antagonist, plenty. You could have other vampires within the city, which means you've got to be stealthy because they can't find out that you're trying to screw them over. It could, like you said, we've got werewolves and mages in the setting. We have humans.
Yep.
Okay. And then you've got the thing of like, well, you can't let them know potentially that you're a
Well,
vampire.
and
And
I
you can't
I
go on a
rarely you speak
bloodbath.
about
So
you speak about werewolves and mages. I think I used werewolves a
yeah,
handful of times. I don't think I personally as a GM never used mages. The human threat is a great one because it doesn't have to be like X-Files, like the hunters or the
yeah,
Winchester
just
brothers show
normal
up.
people.
Although I did that once. I implied that there was a 67 Impala parked in front of this place and some people skulking around. You don't have to do that. The masquerade requires that vampires keep hidden from
Yeah,
human society. And so if you involve the police or you involve, anybody who could see, especially if you're doing it now. Now, it was different 30 years ago because smartphones didn't exist.
yeah,
If you do it now, where smartphones and live social media, live streams are ubiquitous, that actually complicates things tremendously. Because think
yeah,
about it, you could have it be really when you strip it down to brass tacks, you could have a story be very simple. Okay, I'm the prince or I'm the elder, and I've directed you, you little chumps, to again, you're going to protect this building. I have this safe house that I want protected. Um, there is a parcel in a room in this house. You're not to enter the room, and that thing must be protected. You're going to do that for a month, and all that has to happen is maybe it's in a seedy neighborhood, and maybe there's like I don't know, like a meth house across the street, and the cops bust it, and in the process of it the cops want to question you, or the cops like there's a police, something entirely unrelated could bleed into this and create a situation where human authorities are scraping at this place, but not because they think something, they're just doing their regular job. And
yeah.
so that complicates things. You don't forget that layer of the masquerade, how that can, and it can be kind of, I mean, you have the if the characters are out at a club and they're trying to be like cool vampire, suave and use their powers and things like that to get away with things, all they have to do is if they fail, somebody recognizes, or someone, or maybe someone from their mortal life recognizes them randomly or something like
Yeah.
that. It's you can take a very simple story, and by layering the added challenges of being a vampire and trying to stay hidden, you put that on top of it, and everything becomes more difficult. Protecting this house from punk rockers becomes more difficult.
I mean, we did something. I think I had a relatively simple thing where it's kind of like, it was Vegas, so there was a turf war, but it was a turf war between, vampires and like the mafia or something.
Yeah.
So then they have to sort them out. But again, you can take them out, but you've got to take them out and make it look like they were taken out by other humans,
Yep.
not by vampires.
Yeah, you can't tear their heads
Um,
off.
and then there's other like things in the rules where you get crease in it. So I can't remember which version where it was ruled, but it seemed vaguely on the last time, like at some point, because they're vampires, they need to feed.
Yep.
So at one point they were doing either a roll to not have to feed or a feed and roll, and one of them had messed it up, and then they'd gone and fed on someone when people saw.
Yep.
So then that was like, well, actually, that's our next adventure. Our next adventure now is someone has seen you feeding on someone else, and you're going to have to go and
Yep.
stop that problem. Which again, you go and kill that person, but if they've already got more complicated than
Right.
that, so then because sometimes from this whole thing of it's more of an emergent game times game style sometimes in Vampire because it could be something that happens in one. Well, that's your next
Hmm.
session because of this thing that happened. This thing
Right.
happened. Someone saw you, or you did something, or you've got this thing where you've been asked to do something by an elder, but now you've screwed them over. That's then going to set up what happens in the next session. So actually, although your first session might be difficult, start with something like we've said, really simple and then kind of see where it goes. I mean, if you've played like a Powered by the Apocalypse type game, this is how they basically tell you to play it. Like, don't plan everything out in advance. Have some ideas, have some stuff set up, and then go with it, and
Yep.
then
And
play the
that's
game.
where if you don't want to run it in your home area, or your home area you don't think is big enough to support enough variety geographically and like socially within like vampire culture, society, whatever, you pick up one of those by night books and just go from there. But that's why the relationship map is so important between the NPCs,
Yeah,
because as your characters interact, it will emerge what seems to make sense next. But you're right that you can have an incredibly simple story, a very simple requirement, something that they are tasked to do. Remember, if they're neonates, any elder practically in their clan for sure, and any elder at the city level can push them around. So the spurring them to action is already built in, and the nice thing is you can as GM you can communicate that to your players so that they are learning about what is the world like to whom am I answerable. And actually, I've found that that can be, even in some situations with players, slightly jarring in a good way, because especially we're 21st century people, Americans, we're at least a good number of us still are really not inclined to have people just tell us what to do, by fiat. We're like, fuck that, I'm not going to listen to you. And the idea that, like, no, you have to do that. I don't care if you're a software engineer who got embraced because like you're good at embezzling things and your clan decided, like, yeah, we want a forensic accountant within our clan Ventru to cover, no, really, to cover up our money thing. It's like, I don't care if you're like the 21st century Gen Z American. It's like, no, you're a vampire now and I'm going to tell you to do this and you're going to do it and you're going to click your heels and you're not going to complain. Like that idea, that use of social power to force people to do things, there it is. The game gets going. And other than that, I mean, what is it, like the 32, is it 32? I think it is, like the basic plot ideas in literature.
yeah, just use
Any
them.
of those, I'll find a list and I'll put a
Yeah,
link to it. But any of those will do. And then you're layering the vampire politics
yeah,
and the petty interpersonal squabbles over it. And then the challenge of keeping all this stuff hidden. You mix those two other things into a very mundane story, and boom, you have vampire. And the cool thing is, I think that's actually, I just realized this, I think actually that's one of the things that makes World of Darkness
yeah. It does.
special, is because it's supposed to be this darkness that's right behind the real world. So you don't need some wazoo plot
No,
or bizarro complicated
no,
story,
go with the
because you
character.
add those other layers and there it is. It's vampire.
As a quick alternative, if you have a bunch of players who like they're the kind of players that all they do in D&D is fight,
Yeah.
and you really want to play vampire, but your players are like, we don't want to do intrigue, we don't want to do any of this relationship bullshit. We just want to play vampire superheroes. Just have just have these vampires be a vampire death squad that have been sent into a city that is no longer run by the Camarilla. It's gone rogue. It's a Sabbat city. It's full of vampires. It's got ghosts and rage and all, or probably in a shadier part of the world, so none of this is being reported on the news. And they just go in, and every week they've got to kill this different person or blow up this thing, and just do a straight up.
You
They
know
are
what's
vampire
great?
superheroes that are clearing the city of all the bad stuff. You could do that.
Yeah.
I don't
And
think that's the way the game should
story-wise,
be played, but
and story-wise, that works because
yeah,
within the Camarilla, each clan has an enforcer, like a top enforcer, a Justicar, who has a team of archons who are
there
like
you go.
exactly that. And so when someone goes really wrong, some member of one of the clans goes really wrong and is threatening the Masquerade or doing something that's just so unacceptable, it's the Justicar and the Archons who show up if violence needs to be done to take care of them. So you could run vampire, goth 9 Inch Nails, hit squad. You could do that.
Yeah, you could be,
Could.
you could
And
be
it would fit
vampire,
within the world.
vampire GI Joe that goes from city to city, taking out the problems that no one else could deal with. But I mean, it's a very, very different game. But
Oh,
if
totally.
if your players are not up for the intrigue and the politics, but they like the idea of vampires, you can
It
do
definitely
that.
changes the tenor. It's not the same game, but you could
It's not the same game.
no, totally not. And it
But you
becomes
could
like
do
just
it.
like moody, dark goth superheroes.
Yeah,
of
it's the
sorts.
Matrix
Super anti
without the
Yeah,
intelligent bit.
yeah.
Well, I think we've kind of covered it.
Perfect.
There we go. So hopefully that's some useful ideas of how to get some. I think the key thing with Vampire is don't go straight into it. Do a session zero. Get a relationship map. Get some ideas between the characters. Plot out your city a bit.
Yep.
Because then things will happen once you start going, and you can start with something simple, and stuff will just happen because of the way the game plays.
I think I think that's a good pithy piece of it. Don't overcomplicate it.
Yes.
If you include the vampire politics and the traditions, and if you read the rule book, you'll find the traditions, of which the Masquerade is one. You include the traditions, you include the politics with these relationship maps, and you have the looming threat of being found out by mortals. If you do those things, you can take an extraordinarily simple, basic plot and do a lot with it. The other piece, my last thing is, you talked about doing a session zero. If you wanted to have your characters be a little understand what's going on in the city, you could do a session zero where you ask everyone to create an NPC who's one of the major players in the city, and they just each year you discuss through character sketches for each of those, but then you as GM take those and add more to them, and then you finalize the relationship map. So everyone has some clue of who is out there, because it's not so much the what that's important in Vampire, it's the who. And then you build on that and take it from there.
It's worth pointing out also, Vampire is more likely to have player versus player conflict, because when they're from different clans, that can happen, and you just have to be ready for it, or have talk, is this going to happen? Because it is more likely that there's someone behind the scenes saying, I want you to do this, and they're telling one of the other vampires something different. But aware.
All right, so there we go. Links, subscribe, ring the bell, blah, 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 join the Discord, become our close personal digital friends from afar, and all that good stuff. And really give this game a shake. It's a good one. It's an interesting one. It's definitely a different vibe if you I was about to say if you bite into it completely, and I did not mean that as a pun. Oh my golly. I better stop. Thank you, as always, for listening to Fluff and Crunch. You can join our Discord, you can subscribe to the podcast, you can subscribe to the YouTube channel, all through the links in the show notes. Thanks again. Have a great day. We look forward to talking with you.